In this video, we're going to get really creative and create a gauge chart. Creativity can be quite important with our visualizations because it helps us really engage our audience or tell a story, and Rowan wants to do both in this scenario. He has some data here showing different projected sea level rises depending on how well the world responds to global warming. So, for example, in the low scenario, if there's an immediate and positive response, waters might only rise by 390 mil. On the other hand, if there's very poor response, our most extreme scenario, sea levels could rise by nearly 10 meters by 2200. Now, what he wants to do is to create a gauge chart so that the audience can interact with this data. I should probably give you a bit of a roadmap so that you understand some of the choices we're making. To create the gauge chart, we're actually going to use a combination of a donut chart and a pie chart. We're going to start with a donut chart, which has the first half broken into 3 equal segments, and then the second half made up by 1 segment. We're then going to hide the segment on the left, and then we're going to rotate the whole chart through to 270 degrees so that it looks more like a gauge or a speedometer. We're then going to superimpose a pie chart over the top of that, and the first segment of the pie will be our global sea level rise, the second segment our pointer, and the third segment the rest of the pie. We're then going to hide segment 1 and 3 to give us our final gauge chart. Before we can create the chart though, setting up the data is quite important, so we're actually going to do this together. The first thing we need to set up is the gauge itself. And this is really entirely up to you. I would like 3 equal segments, but you could decide to go for a small, a medium, and a large. We then need to make sure that the second half of the chart that we're not going to see is the same size as these combined. So I'm just going to hit an auto sum, and there's my gauge. The pointer is made up of 3 sections, as we saw. The first segment needs to be our global sea level rise. And in your data, this might be quite straightforward. In ours, there's a little bit of a complication because our users can actually choose their scenario. So, for example, intermediate. I'll actually leave that on high. And they can choose their year. So we actually need to do a 2-way lookup to determine which value they want. And you may recall if you did the previous course, probably the best way to do a 2-way lookup is using an index and a match. So clicking into Q4, little bit of revision, equals IN for index. And then our lookup data is going to be all our possible values. So I'm just going to highlight all of that and type a comma. Now, the first thing we need to identify is which row out of that data set we want to get our value from. Now, if we have a look, high is in the 5th row. So we need some way of finding out which position high is in. And to do that, use our match function. So here's our match. And I'm going to match the chosen scenario into my possible options, which I've named. And this is an exact match. So 0, close your bracket for your match. Now type another comma. And we're going to need another match to work out which column our selected year is in. So again, match. Click on the year 2200 and we're going to match that into our years. Again, it's an exact match. I'm going to close my bracket for my second match and I'm going to close my bracket for my index. Now let's just do a quick double check. So for the high scenario in the year 2200, I'm expecting to get back 7,500. And there it is. If I were to go and change my year, for example, to be 2100, you can see that immediately changes to 2000. So that's working. The next segment is going to be our pointer itself, and this will vary depending on the size of your data. I'm going to say, let's take a guess at 50. If it ends up being much too wide or much too narrow, we can always adjust it. And then finally, we need to make up the rest of the pie chart. So we need to decide what our maximum our gauge can go to, and we're going to keep it simple by saying it's 9,700. So the first half of the chart is going to be made up by 9,700 less these 2 values. And the second half of the chart will be 9,700. So our total third segment is going to be equal to 9,700 times 2 less the sum of the two segments we already have. And then I'm going to click enter. So that's our data setup. Let's get creative. I'm going to select my gauge data first. We're just going to start with the gauge, and I'm going to come to Insert, come to my charts, and I'm going to choose a donut chart. I don't need the legend, so I'm just going to flick that off. And then I'm going to come up to Chart Design Format, and we're going to make a few changes. I'm going to make this about a size 16 by 16. I don't need it to have a shape fill, so I'm going to set it to no fill. And I don't need it to have an outline, so I'll flick that off as well. And then I'm just going to move the chart into place in the grey section. Now we can actually get into changing the chart itself. So I'm going to click into the chart data and Control-1 to open up my panel. And here's one of the most important things we need to do for this chart. We need to change the angle of our first slice. We're going to make that 270. And that's how we actually get that distinctive gauge look. So really handy little trick. And we're going to change our hole size as well. I'm going to make that 50. Now clicking into our paint bucket, we need to turn that white line off. So I'm going to come to Border and say No Line. And now we're going to recolor the individual segments. So I'm going to click onto the bottom segment and I'm going to say No Fill. So that's how we effectively hide half the chart. Now with the other three segments, I could just make them a solid color, but we're trying to do something a bit different. So I'm going to click into the first segment and I'm going to add a gradient. This gradient might look different on your system. It's whatever you used last. I am actually going to slide my tab stop on the left over to the far left. If you have more than two, you can just click on this little remove gradient stop to get rid of it. And then with my gradient stop selected, I'm going to change it to the pale yellow from standard colors. I'm then going to click onto my second gradient stop and I'm going to change that to the pale orange. And if yours is sitting on the far right, just pull it in a little bit. And now we're going to change the angle of the gradient because I actually wanted to go from pale yellow to orange. And the easiest way to do that is to come to Direction and find the one that looks closest to what you want. So I want the yellow to the orange on a diagonal. And it's this option over here. That's about a 315 degree. And you can obviously adjust this if you need to. I'm then going to click into my middle segment, again gradient, but this time I'm going to go from the pale orange to a slightly darker orange, and I'm going to pull both of these gradient stops in a little bit. So my second gradient stop, I'm going to click More Colors, come to Standard, and choose the orange, third from the bottom, kind of in the middle, and say OK. And probably for this one, a 0 gradient will work nicely. And then finally, clicking into my last segment, I'm going to make this the dark orange to red. And that's about a 40-degree angle, should work quite nicely there. Maybe a 30. Fantastic. And there is our really nice looking gauge. But now we have to actually get our pointer onto that. So making sure you've got your charts selected, we're going to come up to Chart Design and we're going to click Select Data. And we're going to add another series. So we're going to click Add. And the series name is going to be Pointer. And this can come in handy if you need to modify the chart. And the series values are going to be our pointer values. So I'm just going to select those three and say OK. OK again. What it's done is it's added a second ring to our donut, which is not quite what we want. So let's click into that ring, come up to Change Chart Type, and we're actually going to change our pointer to be a pie chart. And then we're going to put it on a secondary axis. And that's the second trick in here. So make it a pie chart, secondary axis, say OK, and there's our pie chart. Very similar to what we had to do with our gauge chart. Let's just click into the pie. First of all, we're going to turn off the border. We're then going to come to our options, and we're going to change the angle of our first slice to 270. And now all we need to do is come back to our paint bucket icon, click on our first segment and say no fill, click on our third segment and say no fill, and there's our gauge chart. But let's make our pointer a slightly nicer color, so just make sure you've got it selected, and we're going to make that black. We should probably give our chart a nice title, so I'm going to come into chart title, and we can call this Projected Rise in GMSL. But now there's one little thing left I'd like to do. It's not totally obvious from looking at this pointer what the actual value is. So probably a good idea to actually put our data labels on. But this is also going to require a little bit of jiggery-pokery. So just click somewhere onto your pie chart so it's selected, and we're going to turn on data labels. But as you would expect, it's actually labeled the first segment with the 2000 and the pointer with the 50, which is not what we want. So just click on one of your labels so they highlight it. And we're going to come into our Format Data Labels, expand Label Options, and we're not going to show the value. Instead, we're going to get Value from Cells. So tick that first option, and we're now going to select, and this will seem weird, Q3 down to Q5. So basically I'm saying that the first segment gets the word pointer, the second segment gets the 2000, and that's the trick to this. And then I'm going to say OK. Now, of course, we don't actually want to see those other two labels, so I'm just going to click on the first one and delete, and click on the second one and delete. If we then decided we needed to see the millimeters as well, because we haven't put that in our chart title, we can always use our custom number formats. Clicking onto our value in the spreadsheet, I'm going to come up to number format. I'm going to come to custom. It's going to be 0 followed by millimeters in quotes. And when we say OK, it changes it in the spreadsheet, and of course it changes it on the chart. We can now use this visualization to come to our drop-down list and actually have a look at what read we will get for different years and scenarios. But Rowan's taken that one step further and actually added animation. So similar to what we had before, and you can look at the code if you want to. We've got a reset button, which will set it back to 2010, and we've got an animate button, which will walk us through how sea levels will rise for that scenario. So hopefully this has stimulated your creativity, and we really look forward to seeing some of the charts that you're now creating. Don't forget to go and put your ideas in this week's Creative Corner.